In the quiet, gray shadows of a Tuesday dawn in a modest neighborhood on the outskirts of Chicago, Victoria moved like a ghost through the house that had become her prison. The city outside was just beginning to stir, the distant hum of the morning commute a low vibration against the window panes, but inside, the silence was heavy and suffocating. She packed a single suitcase with trembling hands, her movements frantic, yet hushed, as if the very air might betray her if she breathed too loudly. She didn't look at the family photos on the mantel or the stray toys scattered across the linoleum floor. Instead, she walked to the kitchen, took a small piece of paper, and wrote a few lines that would shatter the world of the three innocent souls sleeping down the hall. With a piece of adhesive tape, she stuck the note to the cold, in a white door of the refrigerator, her eyes darting away from the colorful drawings held up by magnets. She walked out the door, climbed into a waiting car, and drove away into the morning mist of Illinois, leaving behind a life she no longer felt she could carry, without a single backward glance at the three-story brick building that held her past. Liam was 9 years old, a boy who had already learned to read the shifts in the atmosphere of his home, like a sailor watches the sky for a storm. When he woke up at 6 o'clock that morning, the first thing he noticed wasn't a sound, but the lack of one. There was no clinking of coffee mugs, no sound of the radio reporting the Chicago traffic, and no smell of burnt toast that usually signaled his mother's presence in the kitchen. He lay in bed for several minutes, his heart thumping a slow, rhythmic beat against his ribs, hoping to hear the floorboards creak. When the silence persisted, he climbed out of bed, his small feet cold against the hardwood, and walked into the hallway. The house felt larger than it had the night before, the shadows longer and more intimidating. He made his way to the kitchen, and there, bathed in the pale light of the refrigerator's hum, he saw the note. He stood there for a long time, his eyes moving over the words again and again, trying to make sense of a reality that his 9-year-old mind refused to accept. The note was brief, written in a hurried scrawl that looked nothing like the careful handwriting his mother used for his school permission slips. It said she couldn't do it anymore, that she needed a different life, and that one day they would understand. There were no apologies, no promises of a return, and no instructions on what to do next. Liam felt a coldness spread from his chest to his fingertips, a paralyzing weight that threatened to pull him down to the floor. But then, from the room next door, he heard the sharp, insistent cry of 3-year-old Paul. The sound acted like a jolt of electricity, snapping Liam out of his shock. He couldn't be a child right now. He couldn't sit on the floor and cry for his mother because Paul was hungry and Ivy would be waking up soon. He took a deep breath, folded the note with trembling fingers, and tucked it deep into the pocket of his pajamas, burying the evidence of their abandonment where no one else would find it just yet. He walked into Ivy's room first, seeing his 6-year-old sister curled into a ball under her pink blankets, her breathing soft and rhythmic. Yet he didn't wake her, wanting to preserve her innocence for just a few more minutes. Then he went to Paul's crib, lifting the heavy, crying toddler into his arms. Paul's face was red, his eyes wet with tears as he searched for the face he expected to see. Liam whispered soft, shushing sounds, rocking the boy back and forth as he had seen his mother do 1,000 times. He carried the 3-year-old into the kitchen and sat him in his high chair, his mind already racing through the inventory of the pantry. He knew they were low on milk, and the bread was starting to feel firm at the edges. He found a box of cereal and poured some into a bowl, feeding Paul one small piece at a time to keep him quiet. At 9 years old, Liam had suddenly become the captain of a sinking ship. And his only goal was to keep his siblings' heads above water for as long as he possibly could. When Ivy finally emerged from her room, rubbing her eyes and asking where Mommy was, Liam forced a smile that didn't reach his eyes. He told her she had gone out early for an errand, a lie that tasted like copper in his mouth. Ivy, with the simple trust of a 6-year-old, accepted the explanation and sat down to eat her dry cereal. Liam watched her, marveling at how easy it was to deceive a child when they had no reason to doubt the people who loved them. He helped her get dressed, making sure her mismatched socks were hidden under her boots, and brushed her hair with a gentleness that was born of pure desperation. He knew he couldn't take them to school because there would be no one to pick them up. And the teachers would ask questions he wasn't ready to answer. He decided they would stay home, telling Ivy it was a special holiday, a secret day just for the three of them. As the first day wore on, the weight of the silence in the house grew heavier. Every time the wind rattled the window or a car slowed down on the street outside, Liam's heart would leap into his throat, hoping it was his mother coming back, hoping the note had been a cruel joke. But the hours turned into afternoon, and the afternoon bled into a cold Illinois evening. He found some cans of soup in the back of the cupboard and heated them up on the stove, standing on a chair so he could reach the burner. He burned his finger on the side of the pot, but didn't make a sound, merely sticking it in his mouth and continuing to stir. He fed Paul and Ivy, ensuring they had the largest portions while he ate what was left at the bottom of the pot. He was already beginning to feel the hollow ache of hunger in his own stomach, but the fear of what would happen if they ran out of food was far greater than his own physical pain. That night, after he had tucked Ivy and Paul into bed, Liam sat on the floor of the living room, staring at the front door. He kept the lights off, afraid that any sign of life would attract the wrong kind of attention. He didn't know where his father, Robert, was. He was a long-haul trucker who spent weeks at a time driving across the vast stretches of the American Midwest. Robert was a man of few words and long absences, a figure who existed more in the smell of diesel fuel and the sound of heavy boots than in the daily fabric of their lives. Where Liam didn't even have a phone number to call him, and even if he did, he didn't know how to explain that the woman Robert had left in charge of their lives had simply vanished. He felt utterly alone in a city of millions, a small boy trying to hold back the tide of a disaster he didn't fully comprehend. As he finally drifted into an uneasy sleep on the sofa, his hand still resting on the pocket where the note was hidden, he had no way of knowing that their plight had not gone entirely unnoticed. Next door, in apartment 4B, Mrs. Rose was sitting in her recliner, the blue light of the television reflecting in her glasses. She was 68 years old, a widow who had lived in this Chicago neighborhood for 40 years. She knew the rhythms of the building, the loud arguments from the second floor, and the smell of burnt garlic from the first floor, and the energetic thumping of the three children next door. She had noticed the silence today, a silence that felt unnatural and sharp. She had seen Victoria's car drive away in the dark, and she had seen that no one had left for school or work all day. She didn't know the family well, having only exchanged polite nods in the hallway, but her instincts, honed by decades of motherhood, were starting to tingle with a quiet, persistent alarm. The second day was harder than the first. The novelty of the special holiday had worn off for Ivy, and she was beginning to grow restless and suspicious. She asked for her mother again and again, her voice rising in pitch with each inquiry. Liam, his head throbbing from a lack of sleep and the growing gnaw of hunger, struggled to keep his temper in check. He invented a story about a sick relative in a different town, a town far away in southern Illinois, saying their mother had to go help because it was an emergency. It was a flimsy story, one that a 6-year-old would eventually see through, but for now, it bought him a few more hours of peace. He spent the morning cleaning the kitchen, trying to make the house look normal, as if a clean floor could somehow hide the fact that their world had fallen apart. By noon, the food situation had become dire. The refrigerator was a desert of empty shelves and half-empty condiment jars. He found a jar of peanut butter and used the last of the bread to make sandwiches for Ivy and Paul. He watched them eat, his own stomach cramping with a sharp, biting pain. He drank water to fill the void, the cold liquid sloshing in his empty belly. He tried to stay busy, organizing Paul's blocks and reading stories to Ivy, but his mind kept drifting back to the money. He knew his mother kept a small jar of emergency cash in the back of the linen closet, but when he checked it, it was empty. Victoria had taken everything, the money, the hope, and the future of her children, leaving them with nothing but a few cans of beans and a note that offered no solace. Paul began to cry more frequently on the second day. He was a toddler who relied on the comfort of a routine he no longer had. He missed his mother's lap, her scent, and the way she sang to him before his nap. Liam tried his best to fill the void, but he was a 9-year-old boy. not a mother. He didn't know how to rock him just right, and his voice was cracking with the strain of his own fear. Every time Paul wailed, Liam felt a surge of panic. He was terrified the neighbors would hear, that the police would come and take them away to a place where they would be separated. He had heard stories about foster care, about children being split up and sent to different homes, and the thought of losing Ivy and Paul was more than he could bear. He muffled Paul's cries with a pillow, whispering desperate pleas for him to be quiet, his own tears finally leaking out and soaking into the carpet. In the apartment next door, Rose was standing by the shared wall, her ear pressed against the cold plaster. She had heard the crying. It wasn't the usual, "I bumped my head" cry or the "I don't want to go to bed" cry. It was a sound of profound distress, a rhythmic and soul-crushing wail that had been going on for hours. She looked at her phone, her thumb hovering over the 3 digits that would bring the authorities, but something stayed her hand. She remembered being a young mother in this city, the overwhelming exhaustion, the moments when she felt she might break. She didn't want to cause trouble for a family that might just be having a bad week. But as the sun began to set over the Chicago skyline, casting long orange shadows across her living room, the crying didn't stop. It grew weaker, turning into a pathetic whimpering that broke her heart. Rose was a woman who had seen much of life's bitterness. Her husband, Joseph, had died 12 years ago, leaving her in a quiet apartment with only memories and the occasional phone call from her grown children in California and Texas. She was used to being alone, but she was not a woman who could ignore the suffering of a child. She put on her robe, her joints aching with the damp Chicago cold, and walked out into the hallway. She stood in front of Victoria's door for a long time, her hand raised to knock, her heart thumping in her chest. She wasn't a meddler, and she didn't want to be the crazy old neighbor who stuck her nose where it didn't belong. But the silence that followed the crying was even more haunting. It was a silence that felt like a void. Inside the apartment, Liam was sitting on the floor of the kitchen, his back against the oven. He had managed to find a single can of beans in the very back of the pantry, hidden behind some old baking supplies. He had opened it with a manual opener, his small hands cramping from the effort. He had put Paul in his lap and was feeding him the cold beans with a plastic spoon. Ivy was sitting at the table, her head resting on her arms, her eyes fixed on a spot on the wall. She hadn't spoken in hours. The light in the kitchen was dim, the single bulb flickering as if it were also exhausted. Liam felt a strange sense of detachment, as if he were watching himself from a distance. He was no longer a boy. He was a machine, a system of survival that was slowly running out of fuel. The knock on the door was soft at first, a gentle rapping that Liam almost mistook for the wind. He froze, the spoon halfway to Paul's mouth. He didn't breathe, his eyes fixed on the wooden door. The knock came again, firmer this time, followed by a voice he recognized but couldn't quite place. "Hello? Is anyone home? It's Rose, aunt from next door." Liam's first instinct was to hide, to crawl under the table and wait for her to go away. But Paul, hearing a voice, let out a small, pathetic whimper. Liam knew then that the game was up. He couldn't hide them anymore. He stood up, his legs shaking, and walked to the door. He turned the deadbolt, the sound echoing like a gunshot in the quiet room, and opened the door just a crack. Rose looked down at the boy, and her heart nearly stopped. Liam looked as if he had aged 10 years in 3 days. His hair was a bird's nest of tangles, his clothes were stained, and his eyes were sunken into his face, dark circles underlining the sheer exhaustion of his ordeal. He was still holding the plastic spoon, a single bean clinging to the edge of it. Rose didn't ask for permission. She didn't wait for an invitation. But she saw the desperation in his gaze and the way he was physically shielding the view of the apartment behind him. She pushed the door open gently and stepped inside, the smell of unwashed clothes and old food hitting her instantly. She looked past Liam to the kitchen, seeing Paul in the high chair and Ivy's slumped form at the table. She didn't need to ask where Victoria was. The note on the fridge, even from a distance, told the whole story. Rose didn't say a word as she walked into the kitchen. She went straight to the stove, checked the pilot light, and then turned to the cabinets. She saw the emptiness, the lack of even the most basic necessities. She turned back to Liam, who was standing by the door, his eyes wide with a mixture of terror and hope. "When did she leave, honey?" Rose asked, her voice low and steady, devoid of judgment. Liam hesitated, the secret he had been guarding so fiercely, finally trembling on the edge of his lips. "Tuesday," he whispered, the word barely audible. "She left a note." He reached into his pocket and pulled out the crumpled piece of paper, handing it to her like a white flag of surrender. Rose read it quickly, her jaw tightening as she realized the depth of the betrayal. Without another word, Rose walked back to her own apartment, leaving the door ajar. Liam stood there, confused, wondering if she was going to call the police. But a few minutes later, she returned, her arms laden with groceries, fresh bread, a carton of eggs, a gallon of milk, and a pack of ham. She set the bags on the counter and began to cook, and the sound of cracking eggs and the sizzle of butter in the pan was the most beautiful music Liam had ever heard. The smell of real food began to fill the apartment, chasing away the scent of neglect. Ivy lifted her head, her nostrils flaring as the aroma reached her. Even Paul stopped whimpering, his small eyes following Rose's movements with intense curiosity. Rose served them a meal of scrambled eggs, toast, and ham. She sat them down at the table and made sure they each had a glass of milk. She didn't push them to talk. She just watched as they ate with a ravenous intensity that made her eyes sting with unshed tears. She saw Liam trying to slow himself down, trying to make sure his siblings were satisfied before he finished his own plate. She reached out and placed a hand on his shoulder, on a simple gesture of comfort that finally broke the dam of his resolve. Liam began to sob, his small shoulders shaking as the weight of the last 3 days finally crashed down on him. Rose pulled him into her lap, rocking him as he cried, her own heart aching for the burden this child had been forced to carry. That night, Rose didn't go back to her own apartment. She cleaned the kitchen, bathed the children, and put them to bed in clean pajamas she found in their drawers. She sat in the living room, staring at the phone, knowing what she had to do. She couldn't hide this. She couldn't keep 3 children in an apartment without legal authority. She knew the law, and she knew the risks. If she called the Department of Children and Family Services, DCFS, there was a chance the children would be taken away. But if she didn't, and something happened, she would be just as responsible as the mother who left. She waited until the children were deeply asleep, their breathing finally calm and steady, before she made the call. The caseworker arrived the next morning, a woman named Sarah who had seen too many stories like this in the streets of Chicago. She listened to Rose's account, read the note, and looked at the children. She tried to track down Robert, the father, but his cell phone went straight to a disconnected message. She called the trucking company he worked for, only to be told that he had quit 2 days ago and hadn't been seen since. He had vanished into the vast highway network of the United States, a man who had decided that the road was easier than the responsibility of a family. The children were officially abandoned. Aunt Sarah looked at the 3 of them, then at Rose, who was standing protectively behind Liam. "They'll have to go to a shelter for now," Sarah said softly, "until we can find a more permanent placement." Rose felt a surge of defiance she hadn't felt in years. "No," she said, her voice firm. "They aren't going to a shelter. They've been through enough. I have a 3-bedroom apartment next door. I have the resources. I want to apply for emergency kinship or foster care status. I'm their neighbor. They know me. Don't take them away from the only home they have left." Sarah looked at the older woman, seeing the fire in her eyes and the way the children clung to her. She knew the system was overwhelmed. The shelters were crowded and foster homes were scarce. She made a few calls, spoke to her supervisor, and eventually, a judge was reached for an emergency hearing. Because of the unique circumstances and Rose's clean record and stable life, she was granted temporary emergency custody. The move to Rose's apartment happened that afternoon. It was only a few feet down the hallway, but it felt like moving to a different planet. Rose's home was filled with the scent of lavender and old books, with comfortable chairs and lace doilies. It was a place of order and peace, a stark contrast to the chaos and neglect they had left behind. Lucas, Ivy, and Paul each got their own space, with Rose rearranging her guest rooms to accommodate them. She bought new toys, new clothes, and books for them to read. She established a routine that was as unyielding as the tides. Breakfast at 7 o'clock, school for the older two, naps for Paul, and dinner together every single night. She became the anchor they didn't know they needed, a lighthouse in the storm of their young lives. But it wasn't easy. The first few months were a blur of nightmares, temper tantrums, and sudden bouts of weeping. Paul would wake up in the middle of the night screaming for a mother who wasn't there. Ivy became intensely clingy, refusing to let Rose out of her sight for even a second. And Liam, the boy who had tried to be a man, struggled with a deep, silent anger that he didn't know how to express. He was protective of his siblings to a fault, often questioning Rose's decisions and trying to take over the chores. It took time and a great deal of patience for him to realize that he didn't have to be the captain anymore. He was allowed to be a 9-year-old boy. He was allowed to play, to learn, and to trust that there would be food on the table every single morning. As the months turned into a year, the temporary status of their living arrangement began to feel more and more permanent. Victoria never called. She never sent a postcard. She never checked in to see if her children were alive or dead. Robert was officially declared a missing person after he failed to show up for any of the legal proceedings regarding his children's custody. The state of Illinois eventually moved to terminate their parental rights, a process that was both heartbreaking and necessary. Rose sat in the courtroom, holding Liam's hand, as the judge signed the papers that made her their legal guardian. She wasn't just the neighbor anymore. She was the woman the law recognized as their protector. The transition from Mrs. Rose to Rosie, and eventually to something closer to Mom, happened in the small moments. It was in the way she helped Ivy with her math homework, the way she cheered the loudest at Liam's Little League games in the parks of Chicago, and the way she held Paul when he scraped his knee. She taught them how to cook, how to care for a garden on their small balcony, and how to navigate the complexities of life with kindness and resilience. She didn't try to erase their past, but she gave them a future that wasn't defined by their abandonment. She told them stories about her own children, about her husband, and about the history of the city they lived in, weaving their lives into the fabric of her own. Liam grew into a tall, serious teenager, a boy who excelled in school, and took his role as a big brother very seriously. He was the one who helped Ivy navigate the social pressures of middle school and taught Paul how to throw a football. He never spoke about the 3 days they spent alone, but the memory was etched into the way he looked at the world, with a cautious, observant eye. He knew that security was a fragile thing, and he was determined to build a life where he would never be helpless again. He decided early on that he wanted to be a lawyer, to fight for those who couldn't fight for themselves, to be the voice for children who were lost in the cracks of the system. Ivy, on the other hand, was the creative heart of the family. She was a girl who saw the beauty in the mundane, who spent hours drawing and writing stories. She had a deep empathy for others, a trait that Rose nurtured with endless patience. Ivy wanted to be a teacher, to create a classroom that felt as safe and welcoming as Rose's living room. She was the one who remembered everyone's birthday, who made handmade cards for every occasion, and who made sure that Rose always felt appreciated. She had moved past the fear of being left behind, replacing it with a fierce loyalty to the family they had built together. Paul, the baby of the family, grew up with no memory of his biological parents. To him, Rose was the only mother he had ever known. He was an energetic, curious boy who was fascinated by the natural world. He would spend hours in the local parks, collecting bugs and studying plants. He had a laugh that could light up the gloomiest Chicago winter, a sound that brought a sense of joy and completion to their home. He wanted to be a biologist, and to understand the intricacies of life and the way all living things were connected. He was the living proof that a child could flourish even in the wake of tragedy, provided they were planted in the right soil. The neighborhood watched as the years passed, the story of the neighbor who stayed becoming a local legend. People would see Rose walking to the grocery store with 3 growing children in tow, and they would nod in respect. She had taken on a burden that wasn't hers, and she had transformed it into a blessing. Her own children, initially skeptical of her decision to raise 3 more kids in her 60s, eventually came to see the beauty in it. They visited more often, their own children playing with Liam, Ivy, and Paul, creating an extended family that spanned across the country. Rose's apartment, once silent and filled with ghosts, was now a place of constant motion and life. However, the shadow of Victoria and Robert never truly disappeared. It lingered in the back of Liam's mind, a question mark that he chose not to investigate. He knew they were out there somewhere, living lives that didn't include him. He felt a cold indifference toward them, a lack of connection that was more profound than anger. He didn't hate them, he simply didn't know them. They were characters in a story he had finished reading a long time ago. He focused his energy on Rose, making sure she was taken care of as she aged, ensuring she never felt the loneliness she had saved them from. He was the first to graduate from college, standing on the stage in his cap and gown, searching for Rose's face in the crowd and finding it, wet with tears of pride. While the children were building their lives in Chicago, Victoria was living a very different story. Her life with Henry, the man she had run away with, had not been the fairy tale she had imagined. Henry was a man of fleeting interests and shallow commitments. Once the excitement of their escape wore off, he found the reality of Victoria's guilt and her constant looking over her shoulder to be a burden. They moved from town to town, living in cramped apartments in places like Indianapolis and Des Moines, working menial jobs that barely paid the bills. 2 years into their relationship, Henry woke up one morning, packed his bags, and left while Victoria was at work. He didn't leave a note. He just disappeared, giving her a taste of her own bitter medicine. Victoria was left alone in a city she didn't know, with no friends and no family. She spent the next decade drifting, her life a series of missed opportunities and regrets. She worked as a waitress, a cleaning lady, a clerk at a gas station. She saw the faces of her children in every child she served, their voices echoing in the quiet moments of her nights. She thought about going back, about trying to find them, but the weight of her shame was too great. How could she explain herself? How could she look into the eyes of the children she had abandoned and ask for forgiveness? She convinced herself they were better off without her, that they had probably been adopted by a wealthy family and had forgotten all about her. It was a lie that allowed her to keep moving, but it was a lie that grew heavier with every passing year. As she reached her late 50s, Victoria's health began to decline. The years of hard work and poor living had taken their toll. She found herself living in a small, damp apartment in a rural part of Ohio. Her only companions, the memories she couldn't escape. She started to realize that the freedom she had sought so desperately was actually a prison of her own making. She had severed the only ties that truly mattered, and in doing so, she had lost her anchor. She began to obsessively search for news of her children online, using the computers at the local library. She found Liam's name on a law firm's website in Chicago. She saw a picture of Ivy at a school awards ceremony. She found an article about Paul's research on local ecosystems. Seeing them as adults, successful and thriving, was a double-edged sword. She was proud of them, yes, but she was also struck by the realization that she had played no part in their success. She was a stranger to their achievements. She saw the woman who appeared in the background of their photos, an older woman with silver hair and a kind smile. She recognized her as the neighbor, Rose. She saw the way her children leaned into Rose, the way they looked at her with love and gratitude. It was a pain more acute than any physical illness. She had handed over the greatest treasure of her life to a woman she barely knew, and that woman had cherished it. Finally, one Saturday morning, Victoria decided she couldn't live with the silence anymore. She spent the last of her savings on a bus ticket to Chicago. She arrived at the Greyhound station in the heart of the city, the cold wind whipping through her thin coat. The city had changed, but the address of the old apartment building was etched into her mind. She walked the familiar streets, her heart pounding in her chest, until she stood in front of the brick building where it had all begun. She took a deep breath, climbed the stairs to the 4th floor, and stood in front of Rose's door. She hesitated for a long time, her hand trembling as she reached for the buzzer. She didn't know what she expected to find, but she knew she couldn't turn back. Rose answered the door. She was 86 now, her face a map of the years she had lived, but her eyes were still sharp and clear. She looked at the woman standing in the hallway, and for a moment she didn't recognize her. Then the recognition clicked, and a cold stillness settled over her. She didn't scream, she didn't slam the door. She simply stood there, a formidable guardian of the life she had built. Victoria looked at her, her eyes filling with tears. "Rose," she whispered, her voice cracking. I'm Victoria. I'm the mother of Liam, Ivy, and Paul." Rose didn't move. She didn't smile. "I know who you are," Rose said, her voice like flint. "What do you want?" Victoria began to cry, the years of suppressed grief and regret finally pouring out. "I just wanted to see them. I just wanted to know if they were okay. I know I don't deserve anything. I know what I did was unforgivable." Rose looked at the broken woman in front of her and felt a flicker of pity, but it was overshadowed by a fierce protectiveness. "They are more than okay," Rose said. "They are incredible people, and they are incredible because they had to be. Because you weren't there." She stepped back and opened the door wider. "Come in," she said. "I'll call them. They deserve to decide if they want to see you." The silence in the living room was absolute, as Rose made the phone calls. She didn't explain much, just said that someone was here and that they needed to come over immediately. Liam arrived first. He was 28 now, a successful lawyer with a sharp mind and a commanding presence. He walked into the room, still wearing his suit from a morning meeting, and stopped dead when he saw the woman sitting on the sofa. He didn't move, he didn't speak. He just watched her, his eyes cold and analytical. Ivy arrived 10 minutes later, her face pale, her hands trembling as she sat down in a chair across from Victoria. Paul was the last to arrive, coming straight from his lab, his expression one of pure confusion. Victoria looked at her 3 children, now fully grown adults. She saw the resemblance to herself in the curve of Ivy's jaw and the shape of Paul's eyes. She saw Robert in the breadth of Liam's shoulders. She felt an overwhelming urge to reach out and touch them, to pull them into an embrace and tell them she was sorry. But she remained frozen. The distance between them was more than just space. It was 20 years of missed birthdays, graduations, heartbreaks, and triumphs. It was a canyon that no apology could bridge. She began to speak, her voice a fragile thread in the heavy air. "I know there are no words that can fix what I did," she said. "I took a wrong turn, and I kept going. I thought about you every day. But I was too a coward to come back." Liam was the first to speak. His voice was calm, level, and utterly devoid of the warmth Victoria craved. "You left a note on the fridge," he said. "Do you remember what it said?" "It said we would understand one day. Well, I'm 28 now, and I still don't understand. I don't understand how you could leave a 3-year-old, a 6-year-old, and a 9-year-old with nothing but a can of beans. I don't understand how you could drive away and never look back." He stood up, his height making the room feel smaller. "I spent years thinking I had to be the man of the house. I spent years being afraid that every time someone left the room, they wouldn't come back. You didn't just leave us, you stole our childhood." Ivy looked at her mother, her eyes swimming with tears. I used to make up stories about you," she whispered. "I used to tell myself you were a spy on a secret mission, or that you had amnesia and forgot who we were. It was easier than believing you just didn't want us. I forgive you, Victoria. I forgive you because I can't carry the weight of hating you anymore. It's too heavy. But forgiving you doesn't mean I want you in my life. I already have a mother." She looked over at Rose, who was sitting in her armchair, her face a mask of quiet strength. "Rose was the one who brushed my hair. Rose was the one who went to my parent-teacher conferences. Rose is the one I call when I have good news." Paul sat in silence for a long time, looking at the floor. Finally, he looked up at Victoria, his expression one of polite curiosity rather than emotional pain. "I don't remember you," he said simply. I have no memories of your face, your voice, or your smell. To me, you are a stranger who happens to share my DNA. I don't feel anger toward you because you can't be angry at someone who never existed in your world. I'm sorry for your regret, but I don't have anything to give you. My life is full, and it's been full since the day Rosie knocked on our door. His words were perhaps the most painful of all, the realization that her absence had been so complete that she had been entirely erased from his consciousness. Victoria looked from one child to the next, seeing the finality in their eyes. She had come seeking a reunion, a chance to start over, but she realized now that the story had already been written without her. She was a footnote in a book she had once hoped to lead. She looked at Rose, the woman who had taken her place, and saw no triumph in her gaze, only a deep, abiding weariness. Rose had done the work. Rose had lived the long nights and the difficult days. Rose had earned the love that Victoria had thrown away. Victoria stood up, her legs feeling like lead. "I understand," she said, her voice barely a whisper. "I'll go." As she walked toward the door, Liam stepped forward. He didn't offer a hug or a handshake, but he looked her in the eye. "I hope you find some peace," he said, "but don't come back. We've built something beautiful here, and it doesn't have a place for you." Victoria nodded, walked out into the hallway, and heard the door click shut behind her. The sound was final. She walked down the stairs and out into the cold Chicago afternoon, and a woman who had finally faced the ghosts of her past and found that they had no more power over the living. She was alone, but for the first time in 20 years, she wasn't running. She was simply gone. In the apartment, the three siblings sat with Rose for a long time after Victoria left. No one felt like talking. The emotional storm had passed, leaving behind a strange sense of clarity. Paul went to the kitchen and began to make a pot of coffee. The familiar sounds of the beans grinding and the water boiling, providing a comforting backdrop. Ivy sat on the floor by Rose's feet, her head resting on the older woman's knee. Liam stood by the window, looking out at the city he had made his own. They were a family, not by blood, but by choice, by shared trauma, and by the incredible grace of a neighbor who had refused to look the other way. Rose reached out and stroked Ivy's hair, her hand trembling slightly with age. "You did well," she whispered. "All of you." She felt a profound sense of relief. She had spent years worrying about this day, fearing that the return of their biological mother would shatter the peace they had worked so hard to achieve. But she saw now that the foundation she had built was solid. Her children were strong, compassionate, and wise. They knew the difference between a mother who gives life and a mother who sustains it. She looked at the photos on her walls, the graduations, the weddings, the quiet moments of joy, and she knew that her life's work was complete. As the sun began to set over the skyscrapers of Chicago, casting a golden glow over the living room, the four of them sat together, drinking coffee and talking about the small things, Paul's latest research, Ivy's students, Liam's upcoming case. The shadow of the past had been acknowledged, faced, and finally laid to rest. They were no longer the abandoned children in a silent apartment. They were the architects of their own happiness. And as they sat there, the lessons of their journey began to coalesce into a truth that would stay with them for the rest of their lives. A truth that Rose had lived every day for 20 years. The true essence of family is not found in the shared DNA or the names written on a birth certificate. It is forged in the fire of consistency, in the quiet, mundane acts of showing up when the world feels like it's falling apart. For those who have reached the sunset of their lives, the perspective shifts from the grand ambitions of youth to the simple, profound value of being a steady presence for someone else. We often spend our younger years chasing after the excitement of the new, the thrill of the escape, much like Victoria did when she drove away into that Tuesday dawn. We convince ourselves that our happiness is something that can be found elsewhere, in a different city, with a different person, or in a life free from the burdens of responsibility. But as the years accumulate, we realize that freedom without connection is merely a refined form of loneliness. The different life we seek is often just a shadow of the one we are already living. And the grass is only greener where it is watered with tears and sweat. For an older person, looking back on a life well lived, the greatest achievement isn't the wealth accumulated or the titles earned, but the lives we have touched and the souls we have helped to anchor. Rose's story is a testament to the power of the neighbor. In a world that increasingly values privacy and isolation, the act of knocking on a neighbor's door because you hear a child crying is an act of revolutionary love. It is the understanding that we are all responsible for one another, that the boundaries of our homes do not end at the front door. To take on the children of a stranger is to acknowledge that every child belongs to the community, and that their suffering is our collective failure. Rose didn't need to be a hero. She just needed to be a human being who refused to let 3 flames be extinguished by the cold wind of neglect. She understood that sometimes, the most important thing you can do is simply stay when everyone else has left. The children, too, learned a lesson that many adults struggle to grasp: that forgiveness is a gift you give to yourself, not necessarily a reconciliation with the one who hurt you. Ivy's choice to forgive Victoria was not an invitation for her to return, but a decision to cut the cord of bitterness that had tied her to a ghost. Forgiveness is the act of reclaiming your own narrative, of deciding that the person who abandoned you no longer has the power to dictate your emotional state. It is a quiet, powerful no to the cycle of pain. Paul's indifference and Liam's cold clarity were also valid responses. The realization that some bridges are burned so thoroughly that there is nothing left to cross. They learned that blood may be thicker than water, but love is thicker than both. They built their house on the rock of Rose's devotion, and when the storm of Victoria's return hit, the house stood firm. As we age, we come to see that the most beautiful things in life are often the ones that are rebuilt from the ruins. A heart that has been broken and mended is stronger than one that has never known a crack. A family that is chosen is often more resilient than one that is inherited. We learn to appreciate the roses in our lives, the quiet, unassuming people who step in when the stars go out and help us find our way home. We realize that it is never too late to be the person who knocks on the door, and it is never too late to be the person who opens it. The legacy we leave behind is not the notes we write on the fridge, but the memories we leave in the hearts of those we chose to love, even when we didn't have to. In the end, the only thing that truly lasts is the warmth we provide for one another in the long, cold Chicago winters of the soul, and the knowledge that we stayed when it mattered most.